The military death penalty in the United States is one of the harshest forms of justice within the armed forces. Since 1916, over 130 service members have been executed under military law. These executions were carried out for crimes so severe that they shocked both the military and the nation. Many of the men on military death row today are former soldiers, individuals trained to defend the country, now condemned for committing unthinkable crimes. This is an intense look at the men whose crimes led the U.S. military to issue its most severe sentence. Welcome to Criminal Records. Timothy B. Hennis, State, North Carolina. In May of 1985, just days before Mother's Day, a horrifying crime shook the quiet military community of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Captain Gary Eastburn of the U.S. Air Force was away on specialized military training in Alabama. Meanwhile, his wife, Catherine, remained at home near Fort Bragg, caring for their 3 daughters, 5-year-old Kara, 3-year-old Aaron, and their 22-month-old baby Jana. The family was in the middle of preparing for a major move to England, where Captain Eastburn had been assigned for an overseas transfer. As part of the preparation, they placed an ad in a local newspaper to rehome their English setter Dixie. That ad was answered by 27-year-old Army Sergeant Timothy B. Hennis, also stationed at Fort Bragg. On May 7, 1985, Hennis visited the Eastburn residence to adopt the dog. By all accounts, he was polite and respectful, and Catherine handed over Dixie, thinking nothing more of the encounter. But 4 days later, on May 11th, alarm bells began ringing. Captain Eastburn's routine phone calls to his wife went unanswered. Newspapers were piling up on the doorstep. A neighbor reported hearing a baby crying inside the otherwise silent house. The following day, May 12th, police entered the Eastburn home and discovered a brutal crime scene. Catherine Eastburn had been raped and stabbed multiple times. In separate bedrooms, the bodies of young Kara and Aaron were found, both victims of savage stabbings. Miraculously, the youngest, Jana, was discovered alive in her crib, though she was severely dehydrated. The scene was devastating. Authorities noted signs that the house had been staged or hurriedly cleaned, possibly to obscure evidence. Despite this, fingerprints and hairs were recovered, pointing toward a single suspect. Several neighbors gave consistent statements to investigators. They had seen a tall man in a members-only style jacket leaving the Eastburn home with a trash bag on the night of the murders, behavior suspicious enough to be remembered. It didn't take long for police to connect the dots. The recent dog adoption linked the family to Timothy Hennis. He matched the suspect description and the timeline placed him in the area. He was soon identified in a photo lineup and taken into custody. In 1986, Hennis was put on trial for the murders of Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. Prosecutors presented circumstantial evidence and eyewitness testimony to support their case. Neighbors pointed to him as the man seen leaving the Eastburn home. The jury found him guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death and transferred to Central Prison in North Carolina, where he joined the state's death row. However, the case was far from over. Hennis appealed, and in 1989, the North Carolina Supreme Court overturned his conviction, citing prejudicial trial errors, problems that may have biased the jury or compromised a fair trial. A retrial was ordered, and this time, the defense highlighted the lack of direct physical evidence tying Hennis to the scene. In 1989, Timothy Hennis was acquitted. Once a convicted murderer awaiting execution, Hennis walked free. He rejoined the U.S. Army and rose to the rank of Staff Sergeant. His military career appeared unblemished, and he retired honorably in 2004. For years, it seemed the case was closed, but the truth has a way of resurfacing. In the mid-2000s, advancements in DNA testing led investigators across the country to reopen cold cases. Samples collected in 1985 from Catherine Eastburn's body were finally viable for analysis. The results, which arrived in 2006, stunned everyone. The DNA was a conclusive match for Timothy B. Hennis. Under normal circumstances, double jeopardy laws protect individuals from being tried twice for the same crime. But Hennis had a unique status. He was a former member of the military. Under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, a service member can be recalled to active duty and court-martialed even after retirement. That's exactly what happened. In 2010, 25 years after the murders, Timothy Hennis stood trial once again, this time in a military courtroom at Fort Bragg. Prosecutors relied heavily on the new DNA evidence. The defense argued it could have been contaminated or mishandled, but the jury, made up of military personnel, was not convinced. On April 15, 2010, Hennis was found guilty of 3 counts of premeditated murder and sentenced to death for a second time. He is currently incarcerated at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, awaiting execution under the military justice system. Over 15 years have passed since this latest death sentence, and roughly 19 years of Hennis's life have now been spent behind bars. His case remains one of the most unusual in American legal history. Not only was he tried 3 separate times for the same crime, but his final conviction came through a military tribunal rather than a civilian court. As of today, Timothy B. Hennis is one of the few individuals on military death row. Despite numerous appeals, his fate remains unchanged. His story is a chilling reminder of how justice can be delayed, but not denied. Hassan, Karim, Akbar, State, Kansas. On March 23, 2003, just days into the United States-led invasion of Iraq, soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division were stationed at Camp Pennsylvania in Kuwait. This was a key forward base, a launching point for troops preparing to cross the border into a volatile and unpredictable combat zone. Nerves were frayed. Tension was high. Everyone knew the days ahead would be filled with chaos. No one expected that the first deadly attack would come from one of their own. Sergeant Hassan Karim Akbar, a member of the 326th Engineer Battalion, was already under the microscope. Described by peers as distant, disgruntled, and troubled, Akbar had reportedly struggled with authority and isolation. He had been written up for insubordination. Some soldiers said he felt targeted or ostracized, and others described him as paranoid, or worse, deeply unstable. In private, Akbar kept a diary. In it, he expressed frustration and resentment. In one entry dated February 4, 2003, he wrote, "I'm going to try and kill as many of them as possible." At the time, no one knew about this disturbing declaration, but it would later be central to the case against him. In the early hours of that March morning, just before 2 a.m., the base fell into sudden darkness. The power had mysteriously cut out, the generator sabotaged. Many soldiers were asleep in their tents, unaware that danger was near. As they lay in their bunks, Akbar crept into the shadows with a duffel bag full of hand grenades. What happened next stunned the military community. Akbar pulled the pins on 4 fragmentation grenades and tossed them into the sleeping quarters of 3 separate tents filled with his fellow American soldiers. He then grabbed his M4 rifle and began firing on the men as they tried to escape. The scene quickly turned into chaos. Explosions rocked the camp, flames tore through fabric, shrapnel ripped into flesh, and confusion spread as soldiers scrambled for cover. When it was over, 2 men had lost their lives. Army Captain Christopher S. Seifert, 27, of Easton, Pennsylvania, and Air Force Major Gregory L. Stone, 40, of Boise, Idaho. 14 others were injured, many of them critically. The attack wasn't random. It was targeted, calculated, and planned. Akbar was quickly overpowered and arrested by fellow soldiers. When authorities searched his belongings, they found the diary that detailed his intent to harm, entries filled with rage, paranoia, and ominous declarations of revenge. It became a key piece of evidence that this was not an act of insanity, but of premeditation. Prosecutors would later point to these writings during trial. In one entry, Akbar claimed that soldiers were disrespecting him and that he would get even. His resentment toward his chain of command and fellow soldiers was no longer just internalized frustration. It had escalated to mass violence. In April 2005, Akbar stood before a general court-martial at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. His trial was held under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The government charged him with 2 counts of premeditated murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Akbar had planned the attack weeks in advance. They showed that the generator was tampered with, that he brought multiple grenades into the tents, and that he had fired his weapon at fleeing soldiers. They described him as a traitor, someone who murdered his fellow servicemen in cold blood. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that Akbar was mentally ill. They argued that his actions were driven by paranoia, stress, and long-term emotional issues. Sleep deprivation and anxiety from the upcoming invasion may have pushed him over the edge. They asked for leniency, citing mental instability as a factor, but the jury was unconvinced. On April 21, 2005, Sergeant Hassan Karim Akbar was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to death, making him the first American soldier since the Vietnam War era to receive the death penalty for attacking fellow troops during wartime. The sentence was automatically reviewed by higher courts, as is required in military law. Over the years, Akbar's legal team filed appeals on various grounds, including mental health, ineffective counsel, and due process violations. Each one was reviewed. Each one was denied. On October 3, 2016, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces upheld his sentence, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene. As of now, Akbar remains on military death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His execution would require presidential approval, something no president has granted since 1961, when Army Private John A. Bennett was hanged for the rape and attempted murder of an 11-year-old girl. Hassan Akbar's story serves as a dark reminder of the psychological toll of war, but also of betrayal from within. In a place where trust is life and cohesion is survival, his actions marked one of the most shocking betrayals in U.S. military history. More than 20 years have passed since the night of the attack, but the memory of Camp Pennsylvania still lingers for those who were there. Today, Akbar's case remains one of the few instances where the U.S. military has pursued and maintained a death sentence in the modern era. Ronald Adrin Gray, State, North Carolina. In the long, grim history of military justice, few names inspire the same level of horror as Ronald Adrin Gray. A former Army specialist stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Gray would ultimately become known as one of the most brutal serial killers in U.S. military history. Between April 1986 and January 1987, he launched a campaign of violence that claimed the lives of at least 4 women and left others traumatized, sexually assaulted, beaten, and in some cases, nearly killed. Gray was born in Cochran, Georgia, and enlisted in the Army in the early 1980s. He served as a cook with the 82nd Airborne Division, one of the most elite units in the U.S. military. On paper, his life seemed disciplined, structured, and service-oriented. But behind the uniform, a darker reality was unfolding. His first known murder took place on April 27, 1986. The victim was 23-year-old Linda Jean Coates, a student at Campbell University. Her death shocked the local community, but at first was seen as an isolated tragedy. Over the coming months, that illusion would be shattered. 18-year-old Tammy Kofer Wilson was his next victim. Her body was found showing clear signs of a savage assault and brutal homicide. Not long afterward, another young woman went missing. Private Laura Lee Vickery Clay, also just 18. She vanished after being last seen with a man who fit Gray's description. Her body was later discovered in the woods near Fort Bragg. She had been shot multiple times. Investigators recovered a .22 caliber pistol at the scene, a weapon that would later be traced back to Gray. Then came the attempted murder of Private Marianne Lang Namath. It was a turning point. Gray allegedly used a ruse to gain access to her barracks, then attacked her, sexually assaulting and stabbing her. Namath miraculously survived. Despite her injuries, she was able to provide a detailed statement to authorities that placed Gray directly at the scene. Her survival would prove instrumental in both solving the crimes and stopping the spree. But before Gray could be taken into custody, he struck again. In January 1987, Kimberly Ann Ruggles, a 23-year-old civilian working as a cab driver, was dispatched to pick up a passenger. Ronald Gray. Later that night, her taxi was found abandoned. Her body, marked by multiple stab wounds and signs of sexual assault, was discovered nearby. Investigators found Gray's fingerprints inside the cab and linked him to money found on Ruggles' person. By now, Gray's face was broadcast across local television stations. The Fort Bragg community, both military and civilian, was on edge. Private Namath, newly released from the hospital, recognized him immediately. So did others who had seen him in the area. The net closed quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA matches, ballistic tests, witness testimonies, and confessions. In November 1987, Gray entered a guilty plea in Cumberland County Superior Court. He admitted to 22 felonies, including second-degree murder, sexual assault, burglary, and kidnapping. The civilian court sentenced him to 8 life sentences, 3 to be served consecutively, the others concurrently. But his accountability didn't end there. Because Gray was an active duty soldier, he was also subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. A general court-martial convened at Fort Bragg, and the proceedings there were even more damning. Survivors and forensic experts testified. Gray's pattern of violence was methodical, predatory, and chilling. The court learned that he not only murdered, he stalked, he abducted, he raped, he planned, and then he killed. In April 1988, the military court convicted Gray on 14 counts, including 2 charges of premeditated murder for the deaths of Private Vickery Clay and Kimberly Ruggles, and 1 charge of attempted premeditated murder related to the attack on Private Namath. He was also found guilty of multiple counts of rape and kidnapping. The jury handed down the ultimate sentence, death. In July of that same year, the commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division formally approved the sentence, along with Gray's dishonorable discharge and demotion to Private E1, the lowest possible rank in the U.S. Army. But like all military death sentences, this one required one more step: approval from the President of the United States. For years, the sentence sat untouched. Then, on July 28, 2008, exactly 20 years after Gray was sentenced, President George W. Bush signed the execution order. It was the first time since 1957 that a sitting U.S. president had authorized a military execution. Even so, the execution has not been carried out. Gray's legal team has filed multiple appeals in both military and civilian courts, challenging the constitutionality of his trial, the effectiveness of his representation, and the procedures surrounding his sentencing. These efforts have so far failed to overturn the judgment, but they've succeeded in delaying the inevitable. As of today, Ronald Adrin Gray remains on military death row at the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He has spent over 3 decades awaiting execution, the longest-serving inmate on military death row in modern American history. His crimes continue to haunt Fort Bragg and the surrounding community. They also serve as a stark reminder that monsters can wear any uniform. In Gray's case, he was a predator hiding in plain sight, moving undetected through a world built on discipline and trust. His actions shattered lives and forced the military to reassess how it monitors, protects, and investigates within its own ranks. Ronald Gray's name has become synonymous not just with violence, but with betrayal, the kind that strikes from within when no one is expecting it. Nidal Malik Hassan. State, Texas. On November 5, 2009, Fort Hood, Texas, became the site of one of the deadliest mass shootings ever to occur on a U.S. military base. The gunman, Major Nidal Malik Hassan, an Army psychiatrist tasked with caring for soldiers dealing with the psychological toll of war, instead turned his weapon on them. 13 lives were lost, and over 30 others were wounded in a senseless attack that would leave an indelible scar on the Army and the nation. It was a typical afternoon at the Soldier Readiness Processing Center at Fort Hood, a busy hub where soldiers came for final medical checks, vaccinations, and paperwork ahead of their deployments to conflict zones such as Afghanistan and Iraq. At around 1:30 p.m., Major Hassan entered the building. Armed with an FN-57 semi-automatic pistol and a .357 revolver, he began his deadly assault. Witnesses reported hearing him shout, "Allahu Akbar, God is great," before opening fire into the crowd of unarmed soldiers and civilians. What followed was pure chaos. Soldiers and personnel scrambled for cover, some ducking under tables, others smashing windows to escape the gunfire. Hassan continued his attack, moving through the building and firing on anyone who attempted to flee. Military police and civilian officers quickly responded, engaging Hassan in a firefight. He was shot multiple times, eventually paralyzing him from the waist down. Hassan was then apprehended and taken into custody. The investigation into Hassan's background revealed a disturbing pattern. A graduate of Virginia Tech and the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences, Hassan was highly educated and well-versed in the mental health challenges faced by soldiers. He had treated many service members suffering from PTSD, anxiety, and the psychological toll of combat. But his professional life was marked by internal conflict. Over time, Hassan's views began to shift, especially regarding U.S. military actions in the Middle East. His personal beliefs were increasingly at odds with his military duties. Emails between Hassan and extremist figures overseas were discovered after the attack. These communications pointed to his growing radicalization, raising the question of whether his extremist views were known to military officials or intelligence agencies before the attack. In hindsight, many wondered whether more could have been done to prevent the tragedy. His increasing isolation, troubling behavior, and extremist inclinations signaled a clear and present danger. Yet the warning signs were missed. In the wake of the shooting, Hassan was charged with 13 counts of premeditated murder and 32 counts of attempted premeditated murder. His trial began on August 6, 2013, and from the very outset it became clear that the proceedings would be contentious. Hassan, refusing to adhere to military grooming standards by shaving his beard, citing religious obligations, caused a stir. Eventually, the court allowed him to represent himself, further complicating the trial. Throughout the legal process, Hassan showed no remorse. He barely participated in his defense, refusing to cross-examine witnesses and offering no witnesses in his own favor. In fact, he openly stated during the trial that he considered himself to be a soldier of Allah and had switched allegiances in what he viewed as a war between the U.S. and Islam. Given these statements, the jury's verdict was almost a foregone conclusion. On August 23, 2013, the military jury convicted Major Nidal Malik Hassan on all charges. 5 days later, he was sentenced to death. The conviction was not only a personal downfall for Hassan but a shock to the U.S. military and the nation as a whole. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army, stripped of his pay, and his military career was forever tarnished. Hassan, now confined to a wheelchair due to his paralysis, remains incarcerated at the U.S. disciplinary barracks in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The final stage of his case rests with the president, who must approve or reject his death sentence. However, as with other military death row cases, the U.S. has not carried out an execution since the early 1960s, and it remains unclear whether his sentence will ever be carried out. The events of Fort Hood continue to reverberate through the military. The attack raised difficult questions about the ability of the U.S. Army to identify radicalized individuals within its ranks, and the failures of military leadership to address growing signs of extremism. Hassan's actions have not only shattered the lives of the victims and their families, but also deeply impacted the Army's approach to screening for potential threats within its personnel.